Section 20 of The Children of Odin. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin. The Book of Northern Myths. By Padraic Colum. Part 4. The Sword of the Volsungs and the Twilight of the Gods. Chapter 1. Sigurd's Youth. In Midgard, in a northern kingdom, a king reigned whose name was Alf. He was wise and good, and he had in his house a foster son whose name was Sigurd. Sigurd was fearless and strong. So fearless and so strong was he that he once captured a bear of the forest and drove him to the king's hall. His mother's name was Hiordis. Once, before Sigurd was born, Alf and his father, who was king before him, went on an expedition across the sea and came into another country. While they were yet afar off, they heard the din of a great battle. They came to the battlefield, but they found no living warriors on it, only heaps of slain. One warrior they marked. He was white-bearded and old, and yet he seemed the noblest-looking man Alf or his father had ever looked on. His arms showed that he was a king amongst one of the bands of warriors. They went through the forest searching for survivors of the battle, and hidden in a dell in the forest, they came upon two women. One was tall, with blue, unflinching eyes and ruddy hair, but wearing the garb of a serving-maid. The other wore the rich dress of a queen, but she was of low stature, and her manner was covert and shrinking. When Alf and his father drew near, the one who had on her the raiment of a queen said, "Help us, lords, and protect us, and we will show you where a treasure is hidden. A great battle has been fought between the men of King Lingi and the men of King Sigmund, and the men of King Lingi have won the victory and have gone from the field. But King Sigmund is slain, and we who are of his household hid his treasure, and we can show it to you." "The noble warrior, white-haired and white-bearded, who lies yonder, is he King Sigmund?" The woman answered, "Yes, lord, and I am his queen." "We have heard of King Sigmund," said Alf's father. "His fame and the fame of his race, the Volsungs, is over the wide world." Alf said no word to either of the women, but his eyes stayed on the one who had on the garb of a serving-maid. She was on her knees, wrapping in a beast's skin 2 pieces of a broken sword. "You will surely protect us, good lords," said she who had on the queenly dress. "Yea, wife of King Sigmund, we will protect you and your serving-maid," said Alf's father, the old king. Then the women took the warriors to a wild place on the seashore, and they showed them where King Sigmund's treasure was hidden amongst the rocks: cups of gold and mighty arm-rings and jewelled collars. Prince Alv and his father put the treasure on the ship and brought the 2 women aboard. Then they sailed from the land. That was before Sigurd, the foster son of King Alv, was born. Now the mother of Alv was wise, and little of what she saw escaped her noting. She saw that of the 2 women that her son and her husband had brought into their kingdom, the one who wore the dress of the serving-maid had unflinching eyes and a high beauty, while the one who wore the queenly dress was shrinking and unstately. One night, when all the women of the household were sitting round her, spinning wool by the light of torches in the hall, the queen-mother said to the one who wore the queenly garb, "Thou art good at rising in the morning. How dost thou know in the dark hours when it wears to dawn?" The one clad in the queenly garb said, "When I was young I used to rise to milk the cows, and I waken ever since at the same hour." The queen-mother said to herself, "It is a strange country in which the royal maids rise to milk the cows." Then she said to the one who wore the clothes of the serving-maid, "How dost thou know in the dark hours when the dawn is coming?" "My father," she said, "gave me the ring of gold that I wear, and always before it is time to rise I feel it grow cold on my finger." "It is a strange country truly," said the queen-mother to herself, "in which the serving-maids wear rings of gold." When all the others had left, she spoke to the 2 women who had been brought into her country. To the one who wore the clothes of a serving-maid she said, "Thou art the queen." Then the one who wore the queenly clothes said, "Thou art right, lady. She is the queen, and I cannot any longer pretend to be other than I am." Then the other woman spoke. Said she, I am the queen, as thou hast said, the queen of King Sigmund, who was slain. Because a king sought for me, I changed clothes with my serving-maid, my wish being to baffle those who might be sent to carry me away. Know that I am Hiordis, a king's daughter. Many men came to my father to ask for me in marriage, and of those that came, there were two whom I heard much of. One was King Lingi, and the other was King Sigmund of the race of the Volsungs. The king my father told me it was for me to choose between these two. Now King Sigmund was old, but he was the most famous warrior in the whole world, and I chose him rather than King Lingi. We were wed. But King Lingi did not lose desire of me, and in a while he came against King Sigmund's kingdom with a great army of men. We hid our treasure by the seashore, and I and my maid watched the battle from the borders of the forest. With the help of Grom, his wondrous sword, and his own great warrior strength, Sigmund was able to harry the great force that came against him. But suddenly he was stricken down. Then was the battle lost. Only King Lingi's men survived it, and they scattered to search for me and the treasure of the king. I came to where my lord lay on the field of battle, and he raised himself on his shield when I came, and he told me that death was very near him. A stranger had entered the battle at the time when it seemed that the men of King Lingi must draw away. With the spear that he held in his hand he struck at Sigmund's sword, and Grom, the wondrous sword, was broken in 2 pieces. Then did King Sigmund get his death wound. "It must be I shall die," he said, "for the spear against which my sword broke was Gungnir, Odin's spear. Only that spear could have shattered the sword that Odin gave my fathers. Now must I go to Valhalla, Odin's hall of heroes." "I weep," I said, "because I have no son who might call himself of the great race of the Volsungs." "For that you need not weep," said Sigmund. "A son will be born to you, my son and yours, and you shall name him Sigurd. Take now the broken pieces of my wondrous sword, and give them to my son when he shall be of warrior age." Then did Sigmund turn his face to the ground, and the death struggle came on him. Odin's Valkyrie took his spirit from the battlefield. And I lifted up the broken pieces of the sword, and with my serving-maid I went and hid in a deep dell in the forest. Then your husband and your son found us, and they brought us to your kingdom, where we have been kindly treated, O Queen. Such was the history that Hiordis, the wife of King Sigmund, told to the mother of Prince Alv. Soon afterwards the child was born to her that was Sigmund's son. Sigurd she named him. And after Sigurd was born, the old king died, and Prince Alv became king in his stead. He married Hiordis, she of the ruddy hair, the unflinching ways, and the high beauty, and he brought up her son Sigurd in his house as his foster son. Sigurd, the son of Sigmund, before he came to warrior's age, was known for his strength and his swiftness, and for the fearlessness that shone round him like a glow. Mighty was the race he sprang from, the Volsung race, men said, but Sigurd will be as mighty as any that have gone before him. He built himself a hut in the forest that he might hunt wild beasts and live near to one who was to train him in many crafts. This one was Regin, a maker of swords, and a cunning man besides. It was said of Regin that he was an enchanter, and that he had been in the world for longer than the generations of men. No one remembered, nor no one's father remembered, when Regin had come into that country. He taught Sigurd the art of working in metals, and he taught him too the lore of other days. But ever as he taught him, he looked at Sigurd strangely, not as a man looks at his fellow, but as a lynx looks at a stronger beast. One day Regin said to young Sigurd, "King Alv has thy father's treasure, men say, and yet he treats thee as if thou wert thrall-born." Now Sigurd knew that Regin said this that he might anger him, and thereafter use him to his own ends. He said, "King Alv is a wise and a good king, and he would let me have riches if I had need of them." "Thou dost go about as a foot-boy, and not as a king's son." "Any day that it likes me I might have a horse to ride," Sigurd said. "So thou dost say," said Regin, and he turned from Sigurd and went to blow the fire of his smithy. Sigurd was made angry, and he threw down the irons on which he was working, and he ran to the horse pastures by the great river. A herd of horses was there, grey and black and roan and chestnut, the best of the horses that King Alv possessed. As he came near to where the herd grazed, he saw a stranger near, an ancient but robust man, wearing a strange cloak of blue, and leaning on a staff to watch the horses. Sigurd, though young, had seen kings in their halls, but this man had a bearing that was more lofty than any king's he had ever looked on. "Thou art going to choose a horse for thyself," said the stranger to Sigurd. "Yea, father," Sigurd said. "Drive the herd first into the river," the stranger said. Sigurd drove the horses into the wide river. Some were swept down by the current, others struggled back and clambered up the banks of the pastures. But one swam across the river, and throwing up his head, neighed as for a victory. Sigurd marked him. A grey horse he was, young and proud, with a great flowing mane. He went through the water and caught this horse, mounted him and brought him back across the river. "Thou hast done well," said the stranger. "Grani, whom thou hast got, is of the breed of Sleipnir, the horse of Odin." "And I am of the race of the sons of Odin," cried Sigurd, his eyes wide and shining with the very light of the sun. "I am of the race of the sons of Odin, for my father was Sigmund, and his father was Volsung, and his father was Rerir, and his father was Siggi, who is the son of Odin." The stranger, leaning on his staff, looked on the youth steadily. Only one of his eyes was to be seen, but that eye, Sigurd thought, might see through a stone. "All thou hast named," the stranger said, "were as swords of Odin to send men to Valhalla, Odin's hall of heroes. And of all that thou hast named, there were none but were chosen by Odin's Valkyries for battles in Asgard." Cried Sigurd, "Too much of what is brave and noble in the world is taken by Odin for his battles in Asgard." The stranger leaned on his staff, and his head was bowed. "What wouldst thou?" he said, and it did not seem to Sigurd that he spoke to him. "What wouldst thou? The leaves wither and fall off Yggdrasil, and the day of Ragnarok comes?" Then he raised his head and spoke to Sigurd. "The time is near," he said, "when thou mayest possess thyself of the pieces of thy father's sword." Then the man in the strange cloak of blue went climbing up the hill, and Sigurd watched him pass away from his sight. He had held back Grani, his proud horse, but now he turned him and let him gallop along the river in a race that was as swift as the wind. End of Section 20. Section 21 of The Children of Odin. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, The Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 4. Chapter 2. The Sword Gram and the Dragon Fafnir. Mounted upon Grani, his proud horse, Sigurd rode to the hall and showed himself to Alv the king, and to Hiordis his mother. Before the hall he shouted out the Volsung name, and King Alv felt as he watched him that this youth was a match for a score of men. And Hiordis, his mother, saw the blue flame of his eyes, and thought to herself that his way through the world would be as the way of the eagle through the air. Having shown himself before the hall, Sigurd dismounted from Grani, and stroked and caressed him with his hands, and told him that now he might go back and take pasture with the herd. The proud horse breathed fondly over Sigurd, and bounded away. Then Sigurd strode on until he came to the hut in the forest where he worked with the cunning smith Regin. No one was in the hut when he entered. But over the anvil, in the smoke of the smithy fire, there was a work of Regin's hands. Sigurd looked upon it, and a hatred for the thing that was shown rose up in him. The work of Regin's hands was a shield, a great shield of iron. Hammered out on that shield and colored with red and brown colors was the image of a dragon lengthening himself out of a cave. Sigurd thought it was the image of the most hateful thing in the world, and the light of the smithy fire falling on it, and the smoke of the smithy fire rising round it, made it seem verily a dragon living in his own element of fire and reek. While he was still gazing on the loathly image, Regin, the cunning smith, came into the smithy. He stood by the wall and he watched Sigurd. His back was bent, his hair fell over his eyes that were all fiery, and he looked like a beast that runs behind the hedges. "Ay, thou dost look on Fafnir the dragon, son of the Volsungs," he said to Sigurd. "Mayhap it is thou who wilt slay him." "I would not strive with such a beast. He is all horrible to me," Sigurd said. "With a good sword thou mightst slay him, and win for thyself more renown than ever thy fathers had," Regin whispered. "I shall win renown as my fathers won renown, in battle with men and in conquest of kingdoms," Sigurd said. "Thou art not a true Volsung, or thou wouldst gladly go where most danger and dread is," said Regin. "Thou hast heard of Fafnir the dragon, whose image I have wrought here. If thou dost ride to the crest of the hills, thou mayest look across to the desolate land where Fafnir has his haunt. Know that once it was fair land where men had peace and prosperity, but Fafnir came and made his den in a cave near by, and his breathings as he went to and came from the river withered up the land and made it the barren waste that men call Nita Heath. Now, if thou art a true Volsung, thou wilt slay the dragon, and let that land become fair again, and bring the people back to it, and so add to King Alv's domain." "I have naught to do with the slaying of dragons," Sigurd said. "I have to make war on King Lingi, and avenge upon him the slaying of Sigmund my father." "What is the slaying of Lingi and the conquest of his kingdom to the slaying of Fafnir the dragon?" Regin cried. "I will tell thee what no one else knows of Fafnir the dragon. He guards a hoard of gold and jewels the like of which was never seen in the world. All this hoard you can make yours by slaying him." "I do not covet riches," Sigurd said. "No riches is like to the riches that Fafnir guards. His hoard is the hoard that the dwarf Andvari had from the world's early days. Once the gods themselves paid it over as a ransom. And if thou wilt win this hoard, thou wilt be as one of the gods." "How dost thou know that of which thou speakst, Regin?" Sigurd said. "I know, and one day I may tell thee how I know." "And one day I may hearken to thee. But speak to me no more of this dragon. I would have thee make a sword that will be mightier and better shapen than any sword in the world. Thou canst do this, Regin, for thou art accounted the best swordsmith among men." Regin looked at Sigurd out of his small and cunning eyes, and he thought it was best to make himself active. So he took the weightiest pieces of iron and put them into his furnace, and he brought out the secret tools that he used when a masterwork was claimed from his hands. All day Sigurd worked beside him, keeping the fire at its best glow, and bringing water to cool the blade as it was fashioned and refashioned. And as he worked, he thought only about the blade and about how he would make war upon King Lingi, and avenge the man who was slain before he himself was born. All day he thought only of war and of the beaten blade, but at night his dreams were not upon wars nor sharpened blades, but upon Fafnir the dragon. He saw the heath that was left barren by his breath, and he saw the cave where he had his den, and he saw him crawling down from his cave, his scales glittering like rings of mail, and his length the length of a company of men on the march. The next day he worked with Regin to shape the great sword. When it was shapen with all the cunning Regin knew, it looked indeed a mighty sword. Then Regin sharpened it, and Sigurd polished it. And at last he held the great sword by its iron hilt. Then Sigurd took the shield that had the image of Fafnir the dragon upon it, and he put the shield over the anvil of the smithy. Raising the great sword in both his hands, he struck full on the iron shield. The stroke of the sword sheared away some of the shield, but the blade broke in Sigurd's hands. Then in anger he turned on Regin, crying out, "Thou hast made a knave's sword for me. To work with thee again, thou must make me a Volsung's sword." Then he went out and called to Grani, his horse, and mounted him and rode to the river bank like the sweep of the wind. Regin took more pieces of iron and began to forge a new sword, uttering as he worked runes that were about the hoard that Fafnir the dragon guarded. And Sigurd that night dreamt of glittering treasure that he coveted not, masses of gold and heaps of glistening jewels. He was Regin's help the next day, and they both worked to make a sword that would be mightier than the first. For 3 days they worked upon it, and then Regin put into Sigurd's hands a sword, sharpened and polished, that was mightier and more splendid looking than the one that had been forged before. And again Sigurd took the shield that had the image of the dragon upon it, and he put it upon the anvil. Then he raised his arms and struck his full blow. The sword cut through the shield, but when it struck the anvil, it shivered in his hands. He left the smithy angrily and called to Grani, his proud horse. He mounted and rode on like the sweep of the wind. Later he came to his mother's bower and stood before Hiordis. "A greater sword must I have," said he, "than one that is made of metal dug out of the earth. The time has come, mother, when thou must put into my hands the broken pieces of Gram, the sword of Sigmund and the Volsungs." Hiordis measured him with the glance of her eyes, and she saw that her son was a mighty youth, and one fit to use the sword of Sigmund and the Volsungs. She bade him go with her to the king's hall. Out of the great stone chest that was in her chamber she took the beast's skin and the broken blade that was wrapped in it. She gave the pieces into the hands of her son. "Behold, the halves of Gram," she said, "of Gram, the mighty sword that in the far-off days Odin left in the Branstock, in the tree of the house of Volsung. I would see Gram new-shapen in thy hands, my son." Then she embraced him as she had never embraced him before, and standing there with her ruddy hair about her, she told him of the glory of Gram and of the deeds of his fathers in whose hands the sword had shone. Then Sigurd went to the smithy, and he wakened Regin out of his sleep, and he made him look on the shining halves of Sigmund's sword. He commanded him to make out of these halves a sword for his hand. Regin worked for days in his smithy, and Sigurd never left his side. At last the blade was forged, and when Sigurd held it in his hand, fire ran along the edge of it. Again he laid the shield that had the image of the dragon upon it on the anvil of the smithy. Again, with his hands on its iron hilt, he raised the sword for a full stroke. He struck, and the sword cut through the shield and sheared through the anvil, cutting away its iron horn. Then did Sigurd know that he had in his hands the Volsung's sword. He went without and called to Grani, and like the sweep of the wind rode down to the river's bank. Shreds of wool were floating down the water. Sigurd struck at them with his sword, and the fine wool was divided against the water's edge. Hardness and fineness, Gram could cut through both. That night Gram, the Volsung's sword, was under his head when he slept, but still his dreams were filled with images that he had not regarded in the daytime, the shine of a hoard that he coveted not, and the gleam of the scales of a dragon that was too loathly for him to battle with. End of section 21.